somewhere around 6.5 billion people are neurotypical, and 1.5 billion people are neurodivergent.
Today, we're diving deep into neurodiversity with Dr. Marc Zakreski. In this episode, he brings a fresh perspective on how neurodivergent individuals can better understand and embrace their unique ways of thinking.
In life, you can either be context-dependent or context-independent. Neurodivergent people tend to be very context-independent. If you see people in your lives that struggle with certain things, you find that from a place of deep empathy, that's probably your brain telling you that this is a person who might be your neuro peer.
From handling social situations to practical strategies on sensory overload and communication, Dr. Marc breaks it down with relatable stories and wisdom that resonate with all of us.
One neurodivergence definitely predicts another one at a much higher level. In the mental health game, we always say name it to tame it. The paradox is that once I accept myself as I am, I can begin to change. But here's the best thing about bravery and traditional masculinity is if you want to be a leader, you want to be that guy that people look to. Being brave, whatever your brave looks like, is absolutely how we not only lift ourselves up, but lift others up too. One of the things that neurodivergent people, because they feel so idiosyncratic, they tend to be these lone wolf, I'll just do it. It leads to a world of a lot of resentment. The people who don't get their needs met become over-accommodators for other people's needs.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with Dr. Marc Zakreski. He's back again, and we're doing a deeper dive into neurodiversity. It was a topic that our listeners really, responded to. I think it's something that is really popular right now, both for people that are realizing that they're neurodiverse at an older age and people raising children that are neurodiverse. So I'm so happy to have Dr. Marc back on the show. Dr. Marc, welcome.
Well, and thanks for having me back. I mean, it's always an honor to get invited back on a podcast. It's like, I must have done something right.
Yeah, it was great. I think we had good, energy back and forth. I think the topic really resonated with a lot of our listeners. I think it's really important. And I wanted to have you back because you mentioned you have a book coming out. It should be out by the time you're listening to this show, called the Neurodiversity Playbook, that helps people with neurodiversity, just navigate the world. I think kind of getting the, instruction manual that they never had growing up.
Well, and that's exactly it. And it's actually, the book even kicks off with this whole story. So I'm on the beach and I'm watching these kids on top of a slide make fun of this other kid at the bottom of the slide. They're like, come up above. He's like, well, you didn't tell me the code. Like, you should just know the code. He's like, you never told me the code. If you don't tell me the code, I can't go up there and play with you. And they were just and I remember watching this and thinking to myself, this is how I feel. It feels like everybody else got went to a meeting and I didn't go, and they all knew what to say and how to say it and when to say it. And I, I've told that story so many times and people really resonate with it because it's why do they all know and I don't know? What's that all about? And so I figured I would do what I could to write a playbook that gets people from where they are to be able to navigate a neurotypical world.
Yeah. I know in our first episode, we talked about the loneliness that neurodiverse individuals can feel. And I think you're really highlighting it again with that story of, feeling left out, feeling confused. I think feeling inept, often giving feedback doesn't make sense, right? Being called that they're too shy, or maybe that even they're too rude and abrasive, or they're weird. What's some of the feedback that, you and some of your clients have gotten as they've been trying to navigate the neurotypical world?
Well, and I mean, it's you tee this up perfectly. Parents will still say to me, it's like, I don't want my kid to be diagnosed because I don't want my kid to be labeled. And I'm like, sure, that's a good point. Their mental health stigma is real, right? That's why this podcast exists, right? And yet, if you don't diagnose your kid as autistic or ADHD or gifted, they're going to get labels anyway. They're going to get labels like freak, nerd, weirdo, creep, right? And, I had a client several years ago, an autistic guy who was going to college. He made a friend in his intro to sociology course, and she's a very pretty young woman. And she's like, "Oh, you should follow me on Instagram." So he went and he liked every single one of her posts that she had ever done on Instagram. She got creeped out and called campus security. Now, my client was like, "I don't know what I did wrong." But he genuinely, and like, campus police thankfully was very chill about it. They were like, "It's clearly this guy's not a threat." And we were able to navigate the situation because you could see it from the girl's perspective, right? A guy likes everything you've done on Instagram, giant red flag alert, except for a very concrete, socially uncomfortable person who's like, "I made a friend. Let me show this person I love them by doing 1,000 hearts on their Instagram," right? So, I always say to my clients, neurodivergence is never an excuse, but it's always context, right? And, he has a good relationship with this young woman still, as they're seniors somehow, which like time is undefeated, I think. But that's the idea, is if we give people ways to understand their brains, then we can help them navigate the parts that are going to be hard for them and put them in situations that play to your strengths, right? If you're somebody who likes a lot of rules and likes a lot of format, well, then things like tabletop role-playing games are going to make a lot of sense for you because they play to that part of your brain that's like, when I'm in this square, I can do these 7 things, but if I'm in this square, I can only do these 2 things. That gives us the cadence and the routine and the give and take of any social interaction, just fleshed out a little bit, made a little bit more organic.
Yeah, so I want to go back to what you're talking about of neurodivergence as not an excuse, but it is context. And I'm curious just to dive right in where you stand on that issue. And I know the answer is probably like, it depends. But, as I'm on TikTok and YouTube Shorts, right? You see all different spectrums of this, right? You see some stuff around neurodivergence that's like, the world has to change to you, they have to accommodate you, and like you're just kind of being who you are, and don't be, be unapologetic, right? And then you have the whole other side, which is like blend in, learn how to mask, learn how to, make it happen. It's a kind of like an oppressed intersectional thing, and you have to just like kind of suck it up and practice, really. So I'm curious for you, like where are you on that spectrum?
So I call this the funeral example, because so in life, you can either be context dependent or context independent. Neurodivergent people tend to be very context independent, right? So it's like, I'm going to wear my comfort clothes. I'm going to have my noise canceling headphones on. I'm going to do me regardless of whether I'm at the DMV, having open heart surgery, or in class, right? And there are spaces in life that give us more bandwidth to do our own thing, right? But then use the example of a funeral. Like, if you're the sort of person who's going to wear sweats and be on your game at a funeral where people want to talk to you, I'm not saying that's the wrong choice, but it's a place that there's a social friction that comes almost immediately because there's a set of behaviors that one is expected at a funeral. Now, maybe you mourn in your own way, right? Maybe you do it your own way. We pivot around that situation. But in its own ways, that's context dependent because you're saying the way I do is not going to fit this particular set of circumstances. Ergo, I'm going to do my own way, which is at some other time and place, right? I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's the best of both worlds. I think the trick for a lot of people like us is knowing when it's time to do your own thing and when the best move is to mask and get through it, and I am all about lowering the barrier to entry, doing universal design, making things more accessible for more people. I think that's the right move. But it's funny, when I was posted my book online, somebody jumped into my DMs and she was like, "How dare you write another book asking neurodivergent people to mask? You're perpetuating the problem, you ableist jackass." And I'm like, am I an ableist jackass? I don't know. I don't think I am, but I thought about it because I'm me. And I came to the idea that I think what I am is aggressively pragmatic. Like, there are 8 billion people on the planet. And if 80% of people are neurotypical, well, I'm not a math guy, but that tells me that somewhere around 6.5 billion people are neurotypical and 1.5 billion people are neurodivergent. There's just a lot more of them than there are of us. And I'm not saying we need to sell ourselves out to do what they do, but there are times that being able to do the dominant paradigm, even if it's for like a 10-minute job interview, goes a lot longer, goes a lot further to making our lives easier. And that's ultimately what I'm in the business of trying to do here. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, the answer is always, it depends. But I think you can be yourself and have the tools to go along to get along when it's most important.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. When I work with my neurodivergent clients, it's very similar of like, I think the needle is moving and it's not going to be like a revolution overnight. So I think if you're trying to survive in this culture, like you said, like getting a job, right? Or showing up at a cultural ritual, like a funeral or a wedding, there are some things that you just have to kind of learn. And it does sound like your book does that. I mean, it does help people like learn to pick up different social cues and learn how to, work in this world. Can you provide an example of like a really concrete skill that the book provides and how it's like laid out and described?
Sure. So one thing that I think this is a nice example of both of both the neuroscience I talked about, but also like the turning it into a functional skill. So, Mark, on the podcast, have you guys ever talked about mirror neurons?
Yes.
I thought so. I'm on a lot of podcasts and I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I wanted to be sure. So we know that the mirror neurons and the neurodivergent brain are on a different frequency, right? They are at a different rhythm. So yeah, the easy way to explain it is that if a neurotypical person's mirror neurons on 4/4 time, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The neurodivergent brain might be on 16th time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. They sync up every once in a while. So you might think to yourself, there I am, but then you spin off into another place, and then there I am. So it's like if you understand that you're on a different wavelength than other people, but those wavelengths do come together sometimes. Let's use meta communication to capture those moments. And so if someone's talking to you and like, yeah, right, instead of faking it, acting like you heard them when you didn't hear them, or saying what they were saying is boring, a meta communication strategy you might use is, you know what? I'm sorry. I was still thinking about the last thing you said. I didn't hear you. Could you say it again? So that's right. You're owning it, but you're owning it in a way that is human and accessible and asking for a redo. And the person might say, don't even worry about it, dude. And the conversation just keeps flowing. But having that tool in your toolbox means you no longer have to white knuckle it through the universe, right? It's not like, crap, I have to guess what they said. Something about former President Martin Van Buren? And they're looking at you like, no, what? We're talking about Chapel Roan. What? You're like, I tried. So the Ottoman Empire. I want to say Ottoman Empire, right? So using those meta communication skills to navigate those moments of social friction, that's a good strategy. And I think that it's more effectively implemented if you understand why you need to use it because of these brain differences.
Yeah, I like that, right? And I think it creates both a level of like humility, right? I think what anyone can learn is being like, hey, I didn't get that, or I'm not following. And I think by and large, most people respond very positively to humility. Like you said, usually like, no problem, dude, or like, yeah, let me explain it, and then they forget about the moment a moment later. It doesn't become like weird or anything like that. And I think it does, like you said, widen the, I guess the aperture for more diversity in our conversations in general, right? To be like, yeah, there is someone that is processing this at a different speed, whether it be faster or slower or whatever it is.
And that the processing speed matters a lot. And it's that's a way that neurotypical people can adapt their behavior. Like, am I talking too fast? Or are you somebody who can keep up with me if I'm going at a super fast rate? And giving people the skills to say, instead of you're boring, manage up a little bit, be like, hey, actually, this is a thing I actually know a lot about. Like, if you want to jump to the higher level, I can follow you. And then it's cool because then the person's like, oh, damn. So we can talk about deep Percy Jackson canon, or talk about how microchips are made, or fill in your blank here. My father-in-law is a retired IT specialist, and he's brilliant. And every time he explains what he did in his job, because he doesn't do it anymore, he would always have to start at the beginning with me, like, this is a packet. A packet is a certain amount of zeros and ones. And I'd be like, oh, I'm not good at this. My best friend, who is also an IT guy, the two of them, it's like, okay, sure, yeah, yep, do it, cool, that's awesome, right? But they, in their very first conversation, they were both trying to like feel each other out. And I just walked over and was like, Gary, Paul knows a lot about this stuff, so you don't have to pull punches with him like you do with me. He's like, oh, great. Paul, what are your thoughts on airline, blah, 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 blah. And then they sound like the mom from Charlie Brown to me, like, blah, 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 blah. So, but they had a great conversation. I think they'd still be in my backyard if we hadn't broken for birthday cake at some point. So that kind of stuff allows us to level set more effectively. And it's a really beautiful way to not only be more socially apt, but also honor somebody else's experience, right? If I'm talking about something you don't know anything about, then yeah, I'm honoring you by meeting you where you are. But then we honor each other by saying, hey, I can do this like you can do it. Let's do it together. And that's awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that sounds like a good strategy for anyone to have, really, right? I mean, I think the more we can pull back and talk about what's happening between two people and like not have it in this realm of mystery, the better we can be, both as like, talking to someone who's neurodivergent, but also like to our partners or to our children or anything. Because I think there's so much guessing. I think even if you are neurotypical, there is this like sense of guessing like people's intention or where they're at or if they like you or not. I mean, I think most people have that going on in their head.
Yeah. Well, and this is where this stuff factors in so well to dating and relationships and sex. Like things like affirmative consent are like, it's a way to both navigate those socially awkward moments. Like, because in movies, they always know when to kiss the person. I mean, I don't know how often you ever knew that. I always was like, is this what I'm supposed to do, right? And we're too close to each other, but we're also not that close to each other. Like, what does that mean? But like, this idea of affirmative consent, can I kiss you? Can I take you out on a date? Should we take this upstairs? Like, not only are those questions that affirm the experience of the person you're about to make out with, but also it's a way to navigate the social anxiety that comes with those moments until you do it enough times that you don't need to ask those questions in the same way anymore, right? It just turns into the old eyebrow raise, like, and like, yeah, right? It's not like we can't do it. We just need to make those unspoken things spoken. So the navigating them becomes a little easier.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense to me. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about, older people, older men is mainly kind of, who I work with, but older people in general, right? Like who didn't grow up with this language, right? Didn't grow up with the spectrum or Asperger's or gifted or ADHD or, what have you, right? Kind of like the grab bag of terms. And they're listening to this show or they're kind of, maybe being exposed to it via their kid. And they're like, wow, what if I have this? Or what if this is how my brain works? How can somebody kind of who maybe felt like they didn't fit in all along start to understand like what the nuances of their neurodivergence might be?
Oh man, and you're exactly right, because we're seeing that more and more, right? Like I jokingly,
yeah, a lot of my guys have that exact issue where their kids get diagnosed and they're like, oh wait, this is also me. I just didn't know that this was a thing.
I actually call it apple tree syndrome, right? I mean, you got a guy whose kid is getting diagnosed on the spectrum because you have sensory needs, right? And then I'll say to the dad, like, I've noticed you also only wear sweatpants. And the dad's like, well, I mean, but like, it's different for me. How is it different for you? Well, because I'm an adult and I get to choose to wear those sweatpants. You're right. Why do you choose to wear those sweatpants? Oh, because I hate every other kind of pants. Oh my God, I'm my kid too. There it is, boss, right? Like,
yeah.
And, it's actually, I think to me, it gets back to that idea of humility you mentioned before. Like, instead of just saying, this is the way I am and I must soldier on and not ask any questions, like, to be intellectually curious requires humility, because you may come to questions that you cannot answer without some outside help or some really deep internal reflection. And guys don't get a lot of cultural messages that we are able or capable of doing that kind of work. But I'm here to tell you guys, and you're on Marc's podcast, so you're probably aligned to think that way anyway, but you absolutely are capable of that kind of work, and you're worthy of the good stuff that's on the other side of it, right? That's the, if you see people in your lives that struggle with certain things and you find that from a place of deep empathy, that's probably your brain telling you that this is a person who might be your neuro peer. And maybe we should explore that a little bit. It can only help you. It can't hurt you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good message. And it's like the idea of really embracing people's individuality, being like, hey, this is who I am, and I'm going to try to build the best life that I can, knowing that these are kind of the factors going into it. I'm curious, as these labels get tossed around, how would you differentiate? Because I get lost. I guess this is also a question for me, right? Between like gifted, ADHD, autistic, highly sensitive, sensory processing disorder. Like there seems to be overlap, but also separate. Like, how do you make heads or tails of this? Is there a way to figure out what you are and what you need to do?
Short answer is we're working on it. We know one neurodivergence definitely predicts another one at a much higher level, right? If you're neurodivergent in one way, you are much more likely to be neurodivergent in other ways. But we understand certain parts of this, ADHD, autism, dyslexia pretty well. We're getting to understand giftedness. We're getting to understand OCD. We're moving in those directions. Things like sensory processing disorder, man, I feel like we're in an infancy in understanding this as a mental health field, because so much of the parietal lobe, where all that sensory processing takes place, is kind of a mystery to us. We're pretty sure it works this way in these circumstances, but there's a lot more we have to learn. And, I just listened to a podcast all about the pain gate threshold, and it was 50 minutes of deep neurochemistry, and I'm thinking there like, man, I understand about 60% of this, and I'm literally a doctor in this stuff. Like, what does your average layperson think about this? Like, and I'm not trying to sound elitist. I'm just trying to be honest. Like, if I don't understand it, damn, who does? Right? So we're really trying to unpack this stuff. But that's actually one of my most, it surprises me, but one of my most popular talks is my talk that I do on sensory processing. And I always talk about it, and people are always like, yes, that's me. And I'm like, oh, this is really out there. There's a lot of people with these sensory needs. And I feel like if you don't have a label for it, your brain is defaulting to that you're broken somehow, right? And, in the mental health game, we always say, name it to tame it. Once you can name it, then you have a much better chance of taming it than you ever did before.
Yeah. Can you unpack some of the symptoms of sensory processing disorder just for our listeners that may not be as familiar with that? Or maybe they'll have the same experience you just mentioned. Be like, hey, that's me, as you're listening to this.
Yeah. And I'm happy to put my slides in the show notes if people want to take a look at it. I mean, I think that it's a thick, right? I'll send them.
Post them.
Yeah. Send it, right? Send it. So sensory processing disorders occur largely in three ways. Sensory stuff is over-processed, right? So in this case, that you are too sensitive to sound, right? Like for me, the sound that styrofoam makes, like, I don't know if you know what I'm like, it's like,
oh yeah, that sucks. That squeaky noise.
Hit me with a cattle prod, man. I'm done, right?
Yeah,
so that's an over-processing. Sensory under-processing is you're not picking up on those things. A lot of autistic people, for instance, tend not to register pain as highly as neurotypical people. One of my autistic clients was walking around on a broken ankle for 6 months, right? People just thought it was sprained because he wasn't complaining because he doesn't feel pain that way, right? And unfortunately, it gets to this sort of broader societal concept of autistic people as slow. It's like, well, how smart could you be if you didn't notice the fact that your ankle's broken? It's like, dude, if your sensory system doesn't pick up on that particular nuance, like, I mean, how many of us have wandered? This is such a guy thing, right? How many of us have hobbled around on a sprained ankle that we probably should have seen the doctor about and didn't? The very first thing my dad ever taught me about medical care was your finger's broken, tape it to the next finger and keep doing the thing you're doing. And I'm like, man, I'm trying to play the guitar. I don't, it's so over processing, under processing, and then there's essentially sensory triaging, where there's a lot of sensory input coming in at once, and your body has to sort out what's most important. And I know for me, that's where I have my biggest problems, because it'll be dinner time. I'll be talking to my wife. The TV will be on for my kids. My kids will be asking me questions. The cat is meowing. And all of a sudden Siri's like, hello, did you have a question? And I'm like, it's too much. It's too much. It's too much. It's too much. Like, because your brain is trying to jam all those things through the bottleneck at the same time. And there's an emotional and social cost to that, right? It's a high level. And what happens is, whether you overprocess, underprocess, or have trouble triaging, the internal experience of trying to do that can send us from under-responsive through the green zone of normal response to meltdown, right? And when we hit the meltdown, then our system shuts down, and we might find it hard to articulate ourselves or to regulate these processes, because our brain is like, I don't know what's going on, so I'm going to red alert. So it unfortunately can become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's like, I feel like I can't do this, and I find that I'm not doing it, so I'm just feeling worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I mean, I have clients that, struggle with this, and they have two experiences, right? Either they get mad and they just blow up the situation and leave, which is kind of the red alert thing, right? Like the fight. Or what I've seen more commonly, I'm curious if you've run into this, is like almost like migraine-like symptoms where people want to go in the dark. They want to just turn off everything, right? Like maybe put on like an eye mask and just let the brain kind of reset, maybe even go to sleep, force itself to sleep. Yeah. Do you see that in the work that you do too?
Absolutely. And it's funny, because I always tell my clients, like, if you have the choice to blow it up or walk away, right? I because I'm a pop culture nerd, right? I call it the John Wick rule. Right, so like John Wick could have walked away. They killed his dog, and that sucked. He could have walked away. He said he laid waste to the entire criminal underworld. And we got 4 great movies out of it. I'm not complaining.
Cool movies, can't complain. But yes, I understand.
But it's like, last year on the Super Bowl, we had a bunch of people over, and I've got the chili on the stove. I'm putting out food and drinks. And my kids, my niece and nephew, my sister-in-law are all in the kitchen, and they're all talking to me about the things they need. And I ended up sort of backed into a corner. I was like, guys, I'm going to lose it. Can I just go outside for 2 minutes?
Right.
And that was really uncomfortable. It really sucked to say that. But I also knew that I was going to scream and holler in about 30 more seconds if I didn't get out of that space. So I walked outside, I took a lap around the backyard, got my breathing under control. And this is a particularly good thing for the guys out there, because our overwhelm, or specifically around sensory overwhelm, is very situation specific. Our brains and bodies are picking up on the cues and stressors in that environment. So if we can change that environment, it gives our brain a head start on re-regulating. Right, it would be like if you're walking through your neighborhood as a kid, and there was that house that had the scary dog. I don't know about you. I'm like, growing up, there was a house that had the scary dog.
Always, there's always one.
Like Spielberg was right. There was always a house with a scary dog. It's always a haunted house, and it'd be like, I'm trying to get my breathing under control while the dog is at the end of its leash, snarling, and foam is flying everywhere. Trying to get your breathing under control in that space versus walking around the corner where you can't see the dog anymore. Yes, the dog still exists, and yes, your body is still dealing with that stress, but your eyes and your vestibular sense are going, the immediate threat is gone. okay, I can redirect some of this energy away from run for your life to how do I get re-regulated? And even 10%, 15% of that energy goes to getting you calmed down, and it become a virtuous cycle. Because the more energy we spend on calming down, the more effective we are at it, the more we calm down, and the more our body just goes, oh, this works, right? And we end up sort of as close to baseline as we can.
Yeah. I think it goes back to the humility piece too, right? It's like just being able to just like name that, be like, hey, I need a moment. I need to go take a deep breath outside, or I need to like be away from this, overstimulating situation, because there's so much there. And I, in the work that I do, and it sounds like we're similar, like I just advocate for people customizing their lives. I think there's another way to customize your life is like, it doesn't have to fit into what you saw on TV growing up or fit into what your parents did, right? Like you can have different ways of communicating and different strategies as you move forward. I think that's even more critical for neurodiverse individuals.
Absolutely. And I mean, yes, part of the reason I like talking to you so much, Marc, is that I think we're very aligned in that way. And, on the other side of customize your life is this idea that if it was easy, you would have done it already. Right? I think for guys in particular, we get so much cultural messaging about masculinity and manhood is a very particular way. Now, it's not all John Wayne anymore, right? But it is still, the archetypes have not shifted too much from there. And inevitably guys will say to me, like, I don't want to be that guy. And I'm like, that's great. The only way to not be that guy is to admit that you're the guy you don't want to be, right? To quote Carl Jung, the paradox is that once I accept myself as I am, I can begin to change, right? I don't want to have sensory needs. Shit, that sucks. I would much rather be someone who could have 19 people talking to me at the same time. I bartended for years, man. I don't know. Clearly I could do it then, right? And there's some shame that comes up with like, why is it different now? But like, all I know is that in high school gym, I could get rim, on a basketball court. Now I can barely touch the bottom of the net. You feel me? Like our bodies change. And like, you don't have to want to be that way, but the sooner you get to a place where you can understand that you are that way, I think the more empathy you can have for yourself.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show. I think people are way more accommodating than we give them credit for. When everything is like colored with shame and fear and terror, and it feels like you're like coming out and that people might judge you and you might be rejected. I think most people are like, oh yeah, I also get overstimulated. Like, no problem. I'll back off. Like it's typically not as big a deal as I think our minds make it out to be.
And I mean, and that's exactly it. Like, and you can't, this is why humility and courage go so hand in hand, because you've got to be courageous and put your hand up and say, yeah, I need this. Right. And one of my guys that I see, he doesn't drink for many reasons. And he's like, I'm trying to make friends with the company. I'm trying to move up. And there's all these happy hours. And he's like, how do I navigate this? Like, he's like, I ran out of excuses for, for why I wasn't drinking. And finally I was like, guys, yeah, I don't drink. And 3 other guys at the happy hour were like, oh, cool, I don't drink either. And now they like sit in a little corner together and like, they talk about not drinking. And the cool thing is they have 4 different reasons for not drinking. Right. And I was like, you never would have gotten that if you didn't do the brave thing. But here's the best thing about bravery and traditional masculinity is if you want to be a leader, you want to be that guy that people look to. Being brave, whatever your brave looks like, is absolutely how we not only lift ourselves up, but lift others up too. Right? If you're that guy in your friend who says, yeah, man, I started going to therapy. Other guys might say that too. Or the other guy might text you later and be like, yo, man, I've never been able to do that. How the hell did you figure that out? That's leadership. That's being a man, because you're just adapting it to the things you need and giving a path for others to follow.
Yeah. And it's just opening space for people to have more of a, diverse experience and not just be stuck talking about the same three topics over and over again. It's just creating more social space. And like you said, being a leader, being a trailblazer, and letting other experiences come in. Because, everybody's really complicated underneath our masks. But I imagine, kind of back to your book title, right? I imagine people that are neurodivergent probably think that everyone just has the same mask on. That there isn't all this complexity, similar to the complexity that they have in their lives. Is that fair to say?
I think you nailed it, right? And, it's really important not to do that cognitive distortion of mind reading of, because I am this way, I am assuming other people are this way. Give them the opportunity to state their case. They may be exactly aligned with you. They may have a similar problem, but deal with it in a different way. Or they may have no freaking idea what you're talking about, right? But once you know where they're at, you can adapt your behavior thusly based on that information.
Yeah, so I'm curious for the other side of the coin, right? How could somebody that is neurotypical or, finds themselves neurotypical, that's in a partnership with someone who's neurodiverse, be supportive? Try to understand how their brain might be working. So,
yeah, it's funny. I start my book with a chapter on some pretty deep neuroscience stuff. Not just because I'm trying to flex what I know, right? That's whatever. Like, I'm not, if I wrote a book for my ego, I'm in the wrong field. But I start with the neuroscience stuff because I think it gives us a shared platform to understand where these differences flow from, right? Because I can think of a very particular dad of a kid I work with. He's like, are you sure my kid just doesn't eat too much sugar? Are we sure ADHD isn't a thing? He dropped because, when I acted up that way as a kid, there's that apple tree syndrome thing again, right? My dad just hit me with a belt.
Yeah.
And I'm like, did that work for you? He's like, straighten me right. He's like, I learned not to do it. I'm like, but did that make it go away? Right. And this is a dad who's like, well, no, but shut up. I'm like, that's the thing. It's like, I can point to you on a brain scan what ADHD looks like, or dyslexia or dyspraxia, and it gives us a really helpful objective context to look at these things through. And I mean, even just being able to show that to your kid's pediatrician or your boss or your kid's teacher or the social worker or whatever it might be, and say, this is my kid's brain. These are the ways it shows up for them. Like, let's use that as a much higher foundation to have our conversations of, because otherwise you've got 6 people coming at this from like, well, it's the parents, it's the sugar, it's the TikTok, it's COVID's fault. Like, it starts with science, and then we individualize it from there. We customize it, to use your language from before.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can they learn about their kid and try to relate with them? And I guess example from my life, right? Like, maybe I'm neurodivergent. I might be in that group that we talked before, where it's like, I didn't grow up with any of that, with any diagnosis, but as I learned more about it, I'm like, yeah, I got some of that, and like, one thing, maybe it's OCD or whatever, is like, I describe it as when things are like out of place, I take like psychic damage. Like, it like literally hurts my brain, right? Like, in a way that my wife, Caroline, does not experience that at all, right? Like, first, she's not aware, she doesn't notice it, she's like not like that. And I'm the kind of person where I need to have like a very clean, tidy environment in order to relax. Whereas for her, she relaxes in a messier environment and then we'll clean it afterwards. So it's kind of like, an ongoing source of conflict in our relationship. I tried to explain to her that it does like hurt me in a way. But I guess I'm wondering, like, how can someone explain their symptoms to somebody who maybe doesn't have that experience, or like you said, might even be minimizing it. Be like, oh yeah, like you played too many video games, or whatever the excuse of the day is.
Well, I in those moments, I always go to Ross Green, which is, kids do as well as they can, right? And I think implicit into that sentence is no one would struggle this much if they had a choice, right? I don't choose to, go into electroshocks every time I hear styrofoam noise, any more so than you choose to take psychic damage when the house isn't organized, right? And I think fundamentally to life is the push-pull between what can I manage and what can I fix? I think that's really what it boils down to. You know, like I'm looking around at my kid's playroom over my computer over here. It's a mess. And like, it makes me a little itchy. I'm going to probably clean it up later. Right. But I know I've also come a long way in that from the kid who had the super messy room growing up to the, as long as it's clean, I'm in control. Right. That's what I got to during COVID. Right. It was like, okay, right. The world's out of control, but I'll control this room.
I'll control this little tiny slice of life that I have. Yeah.
Everything in its place. And I think the language that I tell my clients to use, and I think it's helpful for a lot of us, is I don't need you to feel this. I need you to understand that I feel it. You know, and, you know, I actually started using that language when I was doing a lot more couples counseling, and like, and introverts and extroverts tend to marry each other. So like the extrovert would be like, let's go to this party. Let's go to this happy hour. Let's do a weekend in the woods with my best friends from middle school. And their partner would be like, or none of those things are also options. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, they charge energy a lot differently than you do. And that is not good. It's not bad. It's their reality. Now, you don't have to understand it, but you got to understand that they feel that way. That's their life. So, you know, if you can say to your wife, like, I don't need this room to be clean to my standard, but if you can put a thing away when you walk through, then sooner or later the room is much cleaner and we're both happier, right? Like, she doesn't have to get it, but she has to get that you get it, right? And I think that's a thing that for a lot of guys who have a lot of trouble asking for help, this might be the lowest barrier to entry, right? Like, hey, if you can just make sure the door is shut when you leave, then I feel better. And that's a simple, concrete thing that anybody can do. And once you realize that people are willing to listen to you on that, you might just be able to take the next step up that ladder and ask for something else.
Yeah, I think that's key. You know, and that was such a big part in my story of making these things actually relational. Because what I did, which I know a lot of dudes do, and I imagine a lot of neurodiverse people do, is like, I'm just handling it all by myself in my little microcosm, right? Like, I'm cleaning the room to my standard. I'm organizing things as I need to be. You know, I'm changing the light level in the room. Like, I'm just doing it all in the background. And then, of course, I'm building resentment because I'm like, look at all this stuff I do. I'm making the home so beautiful and so calm and peaceful and tranquil, and you benefit from it. And you don't even see, right? And like, I see that in a relationship all the time versus, again, back to this theme of humility of like just saying like, hey, this is just what I need. Can you help me with this? And making it a connective thing versus making it something that happens in isolation. Because it certainly did, before I learned how to communicate, it started to add a lot to my loneliness and resentment because I was like, I'm just doing all this stuff off camera, you know, before she gets home or whatever. And then no one notices it except for me.
And one of the things that neurodivergent people, because they feel so idiosyncratic, they tend to be these lone wolf, I'll just do it, you know, like,
yeah.
And you hit the perfect word. It leads to a world of a lot of resentment, right? I've got to do 2 hours of work to get to the place where everybody else can enjoy the party, but nobody talks about the 2 hours of work I did to do the party. And they might say, well, you don't need to do that much work. Or like, why do you care so much? It's like, if it isn't done this way, it doesn't get done. Right? And there's some frustration there. And the reality of the situation for a lot of neurodivergent people is you learn that it's easier to not have needs. Right? It's easier to not matter. Now, I don't care if you put yourself last on the totem pole. If you're last on the hierarchy, that's fine. But you have to be on the hierarchy. Like, you have to matter because you are not actually doing yourself or your partner or your family a service by pretending you don't have needs, because everybody has needs. If you get this is a classic neurodivergent person example. There are 5 people at a party and you order a pizza. Mark, how many slices are normal pizza cut into? Right. So if there are 5 people at a party and we have a slice of, it sounds like a middle school math problem, right?
Right.
You know,
I see where you're going.
but you're like, okay, well then we'll just get this pizza, and then all the other 4 people have 2 slices. What do?
Yeah, you take the last one, right? Like you just get the solo.
Solo lone piece, and then they all look at you like, well, now there isn't enough piece for all of us to have 2. So now you feel guilty,
Yeah.
right? So this is the thing. I hereby give permission to all of your listeners, just order 2 freaking pizzas. Just order, because pizza freezes really well, and sometimes people want a 3rd slice, and also you deserve to have pizza too, right? Do a little bit more proactive work so you don't have to respond and contort yourself into a million different shapes to make sure everybody's fine all the time, because it isn't actually your responsibility to make sure everybody's fine all the time. And that is a big shift for a lot of us, but I've seen it 1,000 times. The people who don't get their needs met become over accommodators for other people's needs. Because I think in their heart of hearts, they're like, if I work this hard to accommodate other people's needs, maybe someday someone will look at me and go, hey man, do you need this level of love too? And then you burst into tears, right? Like, please, yes, right? You know, don't stop being kind to other people, but make sure you're saving yourself a slice of pizza too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like communicate about it, right? I think like let people know what you're doing or what assumptions you're making about them. Because I think we can be a good judge of character, but we can also be wrong, and we're like over accommodating people in ways that they don't need to be accommodated, or maybe that might even be like offensive to them. But I think that idea that you're talking about is really true of wanting it back in return. But it's such like a roundabout way of doing it. And we talk a lot about nice guy syndrome on this podcast. And that's what it is, right? It's like those kind of like those covert contracts of like, if I do it for you, now you owe it to me back. And that never works out because none of it talked about, none of it overt. It just is like a straight ticket to resentment, I'm curious kind of on a separate topic, right? Like we have a lot of parents listen to the show, a lot of fathers. How can a father like start to look at their kid to see if they're neurodivergent or start to talk to their kid about neurodiversity? Like, if you could have your way, right? And we live in this perfect neurodiverse world, how would education look like? And how would young childhood look like? How would it be different?
Well, I think we would start with a lot more. I think we would take a look at every kid, right? I think we start with universal testing, right? We get everybody's IQ, we get everybody's learning style, we get everybody, because all kids struggle with executive functioning problems, right? Like the prefrontal cortex is one of the slowest parts of the brain to develop. So if we get a sense of where their levels are when they enter the system, then we can have a snapshot to compare that to as they move along through elementary, middle, high school, etc. And then we do things like universal design, which make things easier for everyone. We say this all the time. The best practices in gifted education are just the best practices in education, right? It's like if you built a school that was handicapped accessible, every single person could enter that school, right? If you email the homework home for every kid, not just the kid with the 504 plan, every single family benefits from that, right? So we should do more interest-based learning. We should give kids more choice in how they're assessed. We should let kids take a deep dive on something if they want to. Yes, that's going to do best for your neurodivergent kids, but every kid in the classroom would benefit from learning more that way, right? And one of the best teachers that I know, she actually no longer works with the gifted population. She got a big promotion. She's like, but I didn't change a thing. Now that even though I don't work with gifted kids anymore, I use all the same practices. I do trivia, I do gamification, I let them do passion projects. And she's like, and maybe the kids aren't hitting that tippy top level that my gifted kids were hitting, but my classroom engagement metrics are really high. The kids are getting good grades, and I am a very well-liked teacher. She's like, because honestly, these are just best practices, right? So, and we can extrapolate that out on the home life too. I mean, think about what clothes your kid likes to wear and hates to wear. How often can we put them in situations where they have those kinds of clothes, Does your kid eat very particular things and not eat other particular things? How often can we put them in situations where they can eat their preferred foods? And as they get older, so you don't have to make 17 different dinners like a short order cook, can you empower your kid to make their own freaking food, right? I mean, if your kid only eats a certain kind of nuggets, well, you know what? You can a 6-year-old could throw those in the toaster oven, wait 5 minutes for them to toast up, and then eat them. Like, that is a completely reasonable accommodation to make at home, and that, my 4-year-old, if he doesn't want what I make for dinner, he knows where the pouches and fruit cups are in our pantry, and he has enough of those that he gets enough calories and protein that it counts for dinner. I don't feel as resentful to him, and he's empowered to do the things he wants. But it really is a win-win. And it's this idea of, let's give up some control so we gain more satisfaction.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And it comes back to the idea of like not trying to put your life or your family in a box. I think like the modern family includes neurodiversity and includes like doing it your way. So I like that you have these like rules or these games or these ways that you can raise your kid that really like accommodates, but also I think like accentuates who they are, rather than forcing them to be somewhere else. And that is something that I hope happens in our education system, that it goes away from just like rote memorization and like, kind of regurgitating facts into some stuff you talked about, project-based work or creative work or things where kids can have like some self-direction in their learning, because the old way isn't really working anymore. I think if it works for some kids, they're good, but most kids, even if they're not neurodivergent, I think they like really rebel against the way education is in this country right now.
I mean, we just keep doubling down on the things that don't work. And then,
yeah, great.
Yeah, I mean, we could do an entire podcast on that. I mean, it's so broken and so backwards, and there's a lot of people who are in positions of power that are maintaining those paradigms, which, like I said, I don't want to sound like I'm wearing a tinfoil hat here. It's just like, there's like a lot of reasons to do that, but it's one of those things that most of the teachers I talk to are like, I don't want to be teaching this way. Most of the parents I talk to say, I don't want my kids to be learning this way. And most of the kids I talk to say, I hate the way school is this way, right? So we are seeing these pivots. And to get to this idea, Mark, of like, you might have to do things your own way, you're seeing more people do homeschooling and cyber learning and hybrid models. I've got a family that does unschooling, right? They just travel the country, right? And they learn Dad has a very high paying job that he can work from anywhere, and they have an RV. So God bless them, right? That's cool. But, I think if there's a thing that's the most true, maybe it's more true now than it's ever been before here in 2024, is that there are more ways to live your most authentic life than there ever have been before. And I think that's really cool. Like, I think that is a paradigm shift that I don't think we're putting that genie back in the bottle, and it's going to benefit a lot of people.
I agree. I think like millennials, we started, but I think Gen Z is like really taking this to the next level. And I think it's really going to be cool of like just the breadth of personal life expression that is possible. I'm curious, I don't even know if this exists, but like, is there like a directory for people to look up different services or something like that? And I'm thinking, I'm subject to had a client who has a child with autism, and he found this school that's a private school up in Bend, Oregon. But they have like rocker chairs where the kids can just like fidget and move as they're moving. They have standing desks where they can get up and sit down as necessary. They let them, when they like have to be punished or disciplined, they let them choose their discipline. So they can like pick time out, or they can run around an obstacle course, or they can do an extra homework assignment, right? So they actually have choice around like what would work them to like get out their energy or like make sense of the situation instead of forcing them just like be quiet in a corner, which for some kids is like hell on earth, And there's tons. There's outdoor space. There's a teepee the kids can go into. I mean, there's like all kinds of different things, and it's it's an expensive private school. But I'm curious, like, where can somebody find these resources that help to accommodate different learning styles and different neurodiversity?
So usually from a organization perspective, I usually start with the Council for Exceptional Children, or CEC. There are CEC networks in basically every state and every major metropolitan area. They'll have mental health, physical health, medical health, and educational resources. And that's everybody from, kids with cerebral palsy to gifted kids to kids who are blind or hearing impaired. I mean, they really do gather those resources. When it comes to sort of homeschooling or unschooling, I usually point people towards, there's the Gifted Homeschoolers Forum within the gifted community, but there's the secular homeschool network, because so much homeschooling is very religious based. They were like, no. We're doing our own version, right? And so we use that because there's usually collectives and groups in your town, in your area, where maybe, you teach your kid your own way Monday through Thursday, but on Friday they all get together and go to the museum. Well, then now your kid's getting socialization and community support, right? And when it comes to things like standing desks, wiggle chairs, chair bands, those things are all covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if your kiddo is in public school and you need those things, then you can put them in a 504 plan, you can put them in an IEP, and they're required to make a reasonable effort to go give your kid those things. Now, the reality of a situation like this is that if your kid is a sixth grader and they're the only kid with a standing desk, it might look a little weird, right? It might, middle school is the time where you really don't want to sort of stick out if you can avoid it. And that's the time where it might make more sense to go for a private school or go for a specialty school. It's the balance of what all these different factors of like what your kid needs and what the impact is going to be, and that's why I often say the single biggest intervention I can make for a family, especially for kids and teens, is finding a school that gets them. Like, kids spend more time in school than they do at home at this age. So if you get a school that lets your kid stim and let your kid fidget, and your kid can walk around and choose their assessment and choose their consequence, then that environment is like wearing your favorite pair of sweatpants rather than trying to jam yourself into skinny jeans every day. Skinny jeans might be what everybody else is wearing, and they might look pretty cool, but you're going to be the best version of yourself in the environment that allows you to spend less energy masking and more energy learning.
Right. I think that's a really great way of saying it, right? Like diverting the resources to actually learning the material and developing rather than just like trying to cope with life, Well, so Dr. Mao, we're nearing the end of our show here, and I'm curious for you, like, what's next? I mean, even just since knowing you for about 6 months or so, I've seen you just skyrocket of those book publishing, doing tons of speaking. I know your like group project Diversity Collective is really taking off. Like, where do you go from here, man? Like, what's your next step?
I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm just on the rocket and it's just going, and I'm like, what's going to happen now? I think there's so much need, right? So we're trying to grow the practice so we can see more people. Probably ultimately I'm going to move to more of a like CEO style thing where I see a few clients, but more manage the practice, write some more books, do some more talks. But I know that wherever this journey takes me, I'm going to keep doing this sort of thing because I think it's inherent on guys like us to not only destigmatize mental health, but destigmatize mental health for men, right? We want more people having these conversations, more people with the word neurodiversity on their lips, more guys out there thinking like, yeah, it isn't a sign of weakness to see a therapist, like, because that's the sort of thing that a rising tide lifts all boats. And the more people like us get the word out there, the more everybody benefits from that downstream. So, and as long as people are willing to listen to me, I'm going to keep talking. And that's
Hell yeah. Yeah, keep getting the word out there. Yeah.
And actually, it's a perfect segue because one of the other things we're doing now is we are launching our own podcast at Neurodiversity Collective. And I'm, without putting you on the spot too much here, Marc, I would hope you'd love to be on my podcast and return the favor sometime.
I'll be there. I'll be there.
Right.
Get the conversation going. Yeah.
I didn't tell him I was going to do this, listeners. I have been literally springing this on him in real time. But I love talking to you, and I think you'd have as much fun talking to me. So
absolutely. Yeah, it's a great platform. I think especially for reaching men, because men do interact with podcasts a ton. And I'm with you, right? I think like we both underutilize mental health resources, and we're not really catered to or understood. And I think if we can both come together between the industry and the clients, we can really help our everything. Help change a lot of these things we've been talking about during the podcast, and help to create just like a more accepting and more effective world for people. So yeah, Dr. Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find you online, and where can they get the book if they want to learn more and listen to you talk?
Yeah, so for the speaking, it's drmattzakreski.com. So if your organization, whether that's a company or a PTA or a homeschool collective, wherever it is, that's where people find me for those sort of talks. For therapy, it's the Neurodiversity Collective. And we practice entirely virtually. So, wherever you are, we can probably find someone to see you. And the book's going to be available on my website, drmattzakreski.com/book. We really thought about that one. It was really, tough branding. It'll also be on Amazon. Just punch into Google the Neurodiversity Playbook, and it'll come up. I've tried to distill the best things about my therapy and my speaking into a book, and I think we was pretty successful at it. So I can't say it was a joy to write it, but it's a joy to have it done.
That's fair. That's how I thought about doing books. Like, there's so much stuff I want to have done, but not that I want to actually do, But yeah, all this stuff will be in the show notes. I will have the Amazon link, as well as the link to his website and social media and future podcast, hopefully. So definitely follow him. I think he's a real expert in the field, and the book is a great way of really condensing that down into one, like an affordable way to access all the knowledge that Dr. Matt has, and a really accessible way that you can do on your own time, asynchronously, and reference as you need as you're moving forward, whether you're neurodiverse yourself or have a neurodiverse person in your life that you love. So Dr. Matt, again, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's really, like, you're doing such great work. It's an honor to be a part of it.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you much for tuning in. So please, do all the stuff, like, comment, subscribe, all those social things. Check all that stuff out. Subscribe, follow us, help support this message, and share this with somebody who could really benefit from the message here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.